Okay, so this is your video lecture on ancient Rome from Republic to Empire. Kind of mentioned this a little bit yesterday. It's kind of the third phase, really, in the development of Rome, ancient Rome. Next is the actual empire and how it existed and how it eventually falls. So let's get through this real quick, and then when you are finished with this, you can obviously continue to work on your crosswords, which you should be able to get most of that done at this point, or maybe 3 or 4 questions that we haven't been able to cover yet, and we will obviously going forward. And then we'll get into the empire part. So that's where we're at. Make sure you keep these notes obviously up to date. It's up to you as to how you want to do this, but the intention is that you do this in class tomorrow, and then we'll move forward on Wednesday. So as we kind of go here, so last time we left it, the Republic kind of was at its peak. Rome was very victorious in the Punic Wars against Carthage, city-state of Carthage. They were the dominating force there now in the Mediterranean region, and continued to accumulate wealth and started to expand the empire as it grew bigger and bigger. Part of that conquest really was the armies to the west and kind of like north, which would be like present day France and even in towards Britain. But in these times it was called Gaul. That's where we're kind of heading, where we're starting this point. So at this point, the empire had, like I mentioned, had stood strong and expanded and accumulating a significant amount of wealth. However, as you could probably figure out, as things get a little bit larger, they get a little bit more, the wealth starts to grow. People start to, get a little bit more selfish with their own agendas. Some internal strife kind of happens within the Republic itself between the citizens, as some of the more wealthy families started to maybe covet a little bit more power. So as Rome's territory is expanding, it's also continuing with some of the issues that come with a large expanded area that they have to rule. So within society, you had patricians and you had plebeians clashed within the Senate. You had, so as I mentioned, some members looking to maybe exert a little bit more power in the Senate. That even though the Senate was made specifically for shared power and limited power. And then thirdly, you had military leaders who were looking for a little bit more influence and power within society as well. So you had a lot of different strands, a lot of different layers to this. But as the empire increased in size, you're going to have an increase in size in terms of potential problems. To that end, a bunch of civil wars. I mean, you don't know what a civil war is. It's basically a war within a country, right? And you have that between different factions. You have it between, the politically powerful. You have it between the military leaders. You have it between society in general, and that's threatening, the stability of the Republic. Starting to see some cracks in the outer shell, if you will, of a republic that at one time was strong and very viable in terms of its wealth and such. Julius Caesar now kind of ends into the picture at this point, where as a military leader, he had made significant headway in Gaul, as we mentioned, present day France. However, a lot of that military conquest was done on his own behalf. He did not get the authority from the Senate to carry on some of these military expeditions, and therefore, there was some concern within the Roman society that, especially amongst the Senate, that maybe Caesar's is starting to get a little bit too big for his own britches, and there was concern that maybe his power should be limited or stripped. And along those lines, he is, he's actually gaining significant amount of wealth He's gaining a significant amount of power and loyalty from his troops because he was a very successful military leader. Also, he spread some of that wealth, throughout his troops, so they kind of benefited from the tribute and from the some of the things that they gathered. And as I mentioned, a lot of those military conquests that he undertook went without the Senate's approval. So he's kind of overstepping his boundaries, so to speak. Along those lines, the Senate orders him back. Like they gave him a couple ultimatums: return home, return to Rome, give up his military command, and return to a status of a citizen. Originally, Julius Caesar was from a relatively wealthy family as a patrician, and so he did have some wealth, although there was some struggles within the family a little bit later on. But for the most part, he was a pretty well respected, well-to-do person amongst Rome society, based on his family and so forth. Caesar does return to Rome, but not for the purpose of the Senate's agenda. He goes back with the idea to challenge the Senate's authority. It's the famous, he gets to the outskirts of Rome and crosses the river, and that kind of initiates another civil war between Julius Caesar, his troops, and then the Senate and their military factions, led by a person called Pompey, who was I don't know if friend's the word to use, but he was a partner of Caesar, prior to this. As I mentioned, Pompey is brought in to command the armies that were being put together by the Senate in order to combat Caesar's challenge. And so now the Republic is under significant duress. I mean, there's problems within the society itself because most of the commoners, if you want to call them that, the people really outside of the Senate, were supporting Caesar. They felt like Caesar had done well for Rome, whereas the members of the Senate were fearful that he would become too powerful, because remember, the Senate was formed to limit the power of any one individual. And what they're seeing before their eyes is that it's Julius Caesar is becoming that person who would take control. In the battle between Caesar and Pompey, a series of battles that are fought over a period of time. Again, gotta be a little bit fearful, or not fearful. You gotta be a little bit careful of when we go through these things, and it seems like these things happen within weeks, and these are things that happen within years and decades in some instances. So the battle between Caesar and Pompey, Caesar is victorious. He had the backing of commoners, plebeian class, the majority of the population, as well as obviously his armies, whereas Pompey was basically supported by the Roman Senate, which, as you know, although they have access to significant resources, they're a relatively small portion of the population. Majority of the population are amongst the commoners and plebeians and such. So Caesar has a lot of advantages in this situation, other than support of obviously the Senate. The fall of the Republic, Caesar is victorious in this battle, the civil war that's fought between his troops and those of the Senate. As a result, Pompey actually tries to flee to get away from what would happen to him if he was captured. He actually tries to flee to Egypt, thinking that he would be welcomed there. Remember, Egypt was a part of the Egyptian Alexander the Great's empire, and then Rome had a little influence, obviously, there as well. And when Pompey gets to Egypt, he's actually captured by the pharaoh or the king of Egypt at the time, and is eventually sentenced to death. So thinking that he would be able to be protected there, he's actually assassinated there. So at this point now, Pompey's out of the way. The Senate's power has obviously been diminished, although it didn't disappear. It's still around there. But there is definitely some concern that Caesar is going to be, named dictator, which is basically what happens. So again, finishing up here with Julius Caesar from dictator to death. After the Civil War is fought and after he's victorious over Pompey, he names himself dictator for life, which is exactly what the Senate was trying to avoid, and really what the Republic was based on. Some three or so centuries before. It's kind of based on a government that was formed to eliminate the possibility. At that time, it was tyrants and things that could become king. Well, now we're looking at a dictatorship. Same result, just different names, I guess. So kind of Caesar does a little bit of political maneuvering in order to name himself dictator, under the provision, if you remember, that the Senate had the ability to name a dictator in times of military crisis. Caesar is able to persuade enough members of the Senate to proclaim him dictator under that provision, although that provision originally was supposed to be limited, like a 6-month window, not for a dictator for life thing. So it was kind of Caesar's way of kind of maneuvering around some of the ways that that were preventing him to becoming the powerful dictator that he becomes. Really Caesar was pretty successful as a dictator in terms of what he did for the Roman society. He was able to decrease the debt. Rome had significant problems with inflation and debt that costs, when you fight wars, it costs money. So there was some of that going on. He also provided aid to the poor and veterans. So he was well liked amongst the commoners. And as majority of the population are the working class, the poor. Veterans typically come from that class in large numbers. So he had support. So he's decreasing the debt, he's making the economy better, he's providing support for majority of the population. And the Senate now is significantly starting to plan his removal. Even though it wasn't the Senate as a whole, there was enough people within the Senate. Senate was made up of about 300 or so people. It's hard to say, it's going to be in that number. All the writings and the stories, Shakespeare and so forth, put that number of Senate members who were in favor of removing Caesar as dictator in terms of just planning this assassination, around 60 or so. And of those 60, I think it might have been around 20 or so that actually participated in the actual plan to kill him. And that's that conspiracy that develops, and there was, it was not unknown to Caesar. And there was plenty of information out there knowing that something was going on. They just didn't know, obviously, when this is going to happen, where it was going to happen, or even if it was going to happen. Finishing up here, you can see the famous picture there, with the members of the Senate there in the white togas, if you want to call them that, the robes. Caesar's being, laid out, attacked by certain members, Brutus being one, and Cassius being another, members of the Senate. Not that you have to know those names, but Brutus was supposedly like a nephew, maybe, or something. He had some kind of a relationship with Caesar, and the story goes in Shakespeare is that once Caesar kind of figures out that he's in the process of being killed during the Ides of March, he is said to have said to Brutus, you too, my son, or you too, or something to that extent. Like he kind of acknowledged that Brutus was involved, even though Brutus was thought to be a family member or family friend or something to that extent. But he's stabbed 23 times. He dies on the floor of the Senate hall. Ironically enough, it was like the Pompey Hall or something, had something to do with Pompey. So Caesar's done. The dictatorship is over. And now there's a struggle as to what's going to happen post Caesar. So the empire is now on the rise, right? Even though the Senate had planned, that everything would be hunky-dory once Caesar is gone, it's actually the opposite had affected. Many of the common people were upset that Caesar was assassinated because, again, he was very popular amongst those people. Matter of fact, a lot of the co-conspirators were hunted down and killed by members of the population. Some of them falsely accused and killed because they shared a common name with someone who was thought to be part of the conspiracy. So it kind of had the opposite effect that the Senate thought it would actually calm things down type of thing. Once this civil unrest goes on for a period of time, again, this is not like a week or thing or a month thing, it took some time. What emerges between a battle between members of the Senate and then Octavian, who was Caesar's nephew. Those two factions fought. Actually, it was Brutus was the head of the other group. Or I'm sorry, it wasn't Brutus. Mark Antony was the head of the other group, and they fought amongst each other for control. When it's all said and done, Octavian emerges from the battles between the two armies. He is now in control and takes on the name of Augustus Caesar, and he is Rome's first emperor. So if you've heard that Caesar was the first emperor of Rome, that's not true. Actually, it was his nephew who was. Caesar was a dictator of Rome, but he wasn't considered to be the emperor. So that's what was stopped